Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World with me, Ashim Kumar. Russia's war on Ukraine has entered a new phase marked by Moscow's largest aerial bombardment on Ukraine yet. As Kyiv reels, Western leaders are intensifying debates over sanctions. A Swiss court has just ruled in favour of Jersey's request to access Roman Abramovich's banking records, part of a wider crackdown on oligarch wealth. Meanwhile, European leaders are heading to Washington to coordinate with the US on tougher measures. Joining us to discuss what comes next is Professor Krzysztof Piech, Professor of Economics at Łazarski University. Professor, welcome back to TV World.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for taking the time. So let's start with Abramovich. What does it mean that his accounts can now be accessed?
It means that the famous Swiss banking system is able to cooperate with Western allies, and it means that the private money can be frozen, not only official Russian assets, but also private ones, which are to some extent enormous as well. And it means it's also a threat to other oligarchs that their money and other assets can be frozen as well.
But what's the legal basis behind giving this this permission to examine his accounts? Is there an implication that he was doing something illegal, such as money laundering, which was the basis of this?
No, it's a matter of sanctions, actually. So all persons that are involved somehow in supporting the invaders, Russia, and its regime, are covered with sanctions. So it means that also the money kept in Western countries can be at least frozen and sometimes even confiscated.
Right. OK, well, I want to talk about sanctions. Can we expect more oligarchs being put in the same position?
Yes, exactly. That's the signal that Switzerland has sent to other countries and to other oligarchs. And this is also the signal that the West, even after 3.5 years of war, that the West is still keeping the track on the assets that oligarchs have somewhere in the world kept secretly.
All right. Now, you say the West is keeping a track on the assets of oligarchs. But, you know, these sanctions have been predominantly in European countries. The US has held back so far. Why do you think that might be?
For the United States, Ukraine doesn't matter so much as for us Europeans, of course. And let me remind one thing that can be a kind of paradox if we speak about the war. Despite all the sanctions, despite Russia is, let's say, attacking to somehow the IT infrastructure in Europe, still European Union imports some fuels from Russia, and that means that every year over 1 billion euros is transferred from European Union to Russia, partially supporting also the war against Ukraine. So, in other words, European Union is supporting Ukraine and at the same time is paying Russia, and that's a paradox. And
so how does Europe overcome this?
Europe is trying to close the relations. I mean, it decided not to renew contracts from the next year, but they couldn't stop the agreements that they had so far because of the problems and costs connected with that. And also the time needed to change the ways of importing fuels. That time was necessary, especially Hungary and Slovakia had problems with that, and still they to some extent support Russia because they feel that they can't have better ways of importing especially petrol or crude oil from Russia through Ukraine. But it's still the ways that we see. It's not so easy to overcome the economic problems behind this war.
Right. Okay. So it's a process, although one does have to question why it's taking so long. I mean, the war started in 2022,
exactly.
Full-scale invasion started in 2022. Now, there's a group of European leaders going to Washington as we speak to discuss sanctions. What do you think's on the agenda?
Further sanctions on especially exports of Russia, exports of fuels, because Russia is very dependent on fuels, gas and other raw materials. And in order to, let's say, stop financing the war, it's necessary to disallow Russia to export its raw materials to especially China, although it's very difficult.
So these are secondary sanctions, what are called secondary sanctions.
Yes.
So we're sanctioning countries that are receiving Russian energy resources. Now, the Kremlin says that's not going to work. Why do you think they're so confident?
A few days ago, we could see the Shanghais of the two leaders of India and Russia, and Europe, if it is even convinced that maybe some sanctions against China could work, but if we speak about India, which were so far to some extent more neutral than China, it could be very, very difficult. So Russia is very confident of what they are saying. But there are also other ways of, let's say, making Russia paying for the war, and this is something what Ukraine has invented during recent weeks or months. I mean, the attacks on the infrastructure, petrol infrastructure in Russia, and this is something that really works and helps with limiting at least the war.
Well, certainly, I want to talk about that in just a second, but I just want to focus a little bit more on the secondary sanctions. If I understand you correctly, what you're suggesting is that imposing secondary sanctions on India and China simply wouldn't be effective because the European Union requires to deal with these countries. Is that right?
Yes, there are a lot of factories, there are a lot of agreements, mutual agreements, bilateral agreements between EU and India, especially with China to some extent as well. And it will be difficult to impose this sanction. Of course, Trump can do whatever he wants if we speak about the customs and so on, but EU is rather more cautious about that, more slower in decision-making process. So from that point of view, we see that without a kind of strong strategic relationship between India and EU, India is going somehow to the area of influence of Russia, which is something threatening over to European strategic interests.
Well, it sounds to me as though secondary sanctions are completely useless in that case, because the two huge economies which are buying Russian oil can't be sanctioned. Do you think the US has a role to play in this?
Yes, US has an important role to play, because the only thing can matter, I mean bank transfers, transfers of money through the banking system. If the United States helps with that and say that all the banks connected with money transfer between Russia, India and China will be cut off of the rest of the financial system, world financial system, that could really work. Otherwise, the interests, macroeconomic interests between especially India and EU will prevail.
Right, well, we shall see. I mean, because that sounds like a pretty big step with economic reverberations throughout the world, if it does happen. So what about the shadow fleet of ships? You know, much was said about it, and then everyone's gone quiet. I mean, those ships are transporting Russian gas and oil around the world. Should more be done?
Yes, of course, and everybody knows about that for at least months, that it is happening, but no steps were taken because maybe United Nations has no mandate to do something with that. So this is a large problem, because of course there are sanctions, but there are so many easy ways to overcome them. It's kind of it is telling the world that the EU is not very serious in being able to be a global strategic
Right, it's
player.
a sanctions strategy full of huge holes, it sounds like.
Yes, exactly.
Unfortunately, Professor, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed
Thank
for
you very
sharing
much.
your analysis
Thank
with
you
our
very much.
audience. Thank you. And that brings us to the end of this episode of World Talks. Don't go away, though, lots more coming up. Goodbye.